This afternoon's panel on science and the humanities doubtless will offer an excellent demonstration of why the matters that humanists study matter. The relations or lack of relations between the humanities and the natural sciences has been a subject of long-standing debate and disagreement, perhaps since as far back as the scientific revolution of the early modern period. More than 60 years ago, the British scientist and novelist C.P. Snow famously took up and codified the debate, lamenting that the humanities and natural sciences had become so distant and detached from each other that they effectively constituted two cultures separated by a gulf of mutual incomprehension and hostility. Those are Snow's words. Today, the question of the relations or distances between the humanities and the natural sciences seems, once again, newly urgent. Ours is a moment, in public discourse at least, when both the humanities and the sciences are subject to increasing scrutiny and even attack. A moment within the academy when colleges and universities are investing in the sciences and divesting from the humanities. A moment when the University of Oregon is completing the final stage of the night campus for accelerating scientific impact while shrinking humanities departments, and a moment when the OHC is celebrating our 40th anniversary. In response to these enduring debates and more recent developments, and as part of our anniversary theme of Humanities Matters, we've invited 3 UO humanities faculty whose scholarship engages the natural sciences in various ways to talk about their work across the divide between the two cultures and why that work matters. Why it is important for humanists to study the sciences, to work with scientists, and to interrogate the two cultures' divide. We've asked each of our panelists to speak in response to our topic from their particular perspectives and expertise for about 15 to 20 minutes. And at that point, we'll open the floor for questions from the panelists. And it's now my pleasure to introduce them briefly. And if I enumerated all of the accomplishments of our panelists, we would be here for another hour. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview. We'll hear first from Vera Keller, professor and department head of history. Professor Keller is a historian of early modern Europe, particularly interested in the emergence of experimental science and the entanglements of research with capitalism, colonialism, and political economy, and more broadly in the history of knowledge, of research, and of the research disciplines. Next, we'll hear from Nicolae Morar, Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and Philosophy, and Associate Member of the UO's Institute for Ecology and Evolution. Professor Morar's research interests lie at the intersection of biology, ecology, and bioethics. His work considers how various conceptual analyses in philosophy of biology and ecology influence and transform debates in bioethics and in ethics broadly construed. And finally, we'll hear from Sarah Smith, Assistant Professor of Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies and Black Studies. Professor Smith's research focuses on 20th and 21st century U.S. Black literature, Black studies, and the health humanities. Their current book project analyzes how and why U.S. Black artists use biology to depict racialized life. So please join me in welcoming our panelists.
So today I'm going to, can you hear me? Okay, great. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the period I study and some of the things that I focus on in the period, particularly the role of hinting and hoping, as a way for us to reconceptualize what the scientific revolution was and what that can tell us about what these sciences are and are not today and how we might rethink them. Because the scientific revolution, which was a 20th century narrative about knowledge changes that took place in early modern Europe from approximately 1500 to 1700, has been and still often is deployed to distinguish between science, the singular, and other forms of knowledge. So, just to take something from what is now X, this post, for example, about Francis Bacon, the father of scientific method, suggests that it is scientific method, often attributed to Bacon, that separates science from all else. This is a complete myth, and I'm not by far the first historian to point this out. There is no one science nor one method. all academics use techniques to craft knowledge that we learned from our graduate advisors in graduate school and continue to hone in our professional communities. We all use, for example, reading, whether we use close reading or distant reading, we've all learned how to read professionally from our particular craft. There is no epistemological difference between what we now call science and other forms of knowledge, and there are disciplines across presumed divides whose epistemologies are actually very close. So to take one example of my own discipline, history and biology, I would argue is very close, and that's why biology until recently was part of history. It was part of natural history. So today, in about 10 to 15 minutes, I am going to very quickly touch upon what were the changes that took place in knowledge in the period I study. What role did, for example, Bacon and his followers play in that? I'm going to focus on hints. And what does this mean for how we might reconsider today's knowledge and suggest new approaches for the future? So, the institution in which we currently are, the university, we can trace back, for example, to 1088 University of Bologna, the first university in Europe, in the Latin West. And the curriculum was set throughout the medieval period until the period I study as the trivium and quadrivium of the liberal arts, as you probably know, which included such fields as grammar, rhetoric, logic, and astrology there, which is the same thing as astronomy, music, geometry, and arithmetic. It also included 7 virtues, because the idea was that the liberal arts are supposed to offer you a means to improve as a person, and in particular to escape the mortal coil, to escape human needs and errors, and to rise on this kind of 7-step scale away from the human condition. So 7 virtues here are prudence, justice, faith, charity, hope, fortitude, and temperance. And all of this was based on a cosmic structure of the 7 crystalline spheres in which we all lived, and which, rubbing against each other, produced a beautiful cosmic harmony that none of us recognize because we'd been born into it. So we're in this incredible music that's going on all the time that we don't even notice. The idea is that this is divinely authored, it's not humanly authored, and it's not supposed to ever change. And our goal is to escape from the very bottommost level right up into heaven, which is the only place where actual knowledge resides, actual truth lives. And so for the first 600 years of the university as an institution, what you sought was scientia, science, which means knowledge so certain that it proves itself, and is not based on any kind of experimental evidence or any other kind of evidence, particularly that based on the senses. So this is a representation of science, and you can see that she has wings from her head because her rationality is flying above the world of the body. She is very balanced and poised, staring into a mirror because she only needs to look at herself. She doesn't need to look at anything else. She has in her hand these geometrical solids to show how complete and not aberrant her knowledge is and how harmonious it is. No differences of opinion. Contrast that with curiosity, who is kind of more like me, right? Her hair is all over the place. Her arms are akimbo. She's really grabby. She's really going to go around the world and kind of get stuff. There's no mirror here. Her wings are on her body because her desires for knowledge, her way of seeking knowledge is all bodily. And her dress is covered with ears and, as we know, frogs, which symbolize curiosity. It's not cats in this period. So this is a sin. It's a sin particularly associated with women. And for many, it is the original sin, that this desire for knowledge, this is the wrong kind of knowledge. This is the good kind of knowledge, scientia. The university is supposed to be teaching scientia and avoiding curiosity. This changes during the early modern period, many reasons for this. But because of this period of extensive change, humans have a newfound appreciation for the extent of their ignorance. They also come to accept the fact that their structures of knowledge were not divinely authored, but were the products of fallible humans, that they could change and would change in the future. And as part of these massive reorientations of knowledge in this time, curiosity was recuperated from being a female vice to being a male virtue. and it is still one of the preeminent virtues of science today, curiosity. So one of the things that changed about the structure of knowledge was this change from an orb, a series of nested orbs that formed a whole and interconnected, the orb of the Encyclopedia of the Disciplines, which this poor scholar is groaning to uphold on his back. I mean, look at those leg muscles. He's about to collapse. And that was broken apart and transformed into the shape that knowledge still has today, which is fields of knowledge, not really disciplines in the real sense of the word discipline, but these strategic, somewhat temporary and shifting deployments of particular units. So this is a battle array from the study of tactics, and this is kind of the shape of knowledge that takes over from the orb. And the person that I particularly focused on in my last book, which is coming out actually this summer, on purpose based his kind of review of the structures of knowledge on the study of battlefields. He felt that this was really the true new order. So this idea that there is no certain knowledge and there is no ladder to get to truth meant a rejection of method, not the creation of method. Because what method meant from Greek is a path through. It is a very certain path through. You start from point A, you get to point B, you arrive almost mechanistically at your answer as a way to kind of assure that you have reached truth. And what it meant in the early modern period was a way to show and transmit what the logical structure, deducible logical structure of knowledge was. So it looked something like this. Especially once print was invented, people got really into these charts. They would break down units of knowledge so you could see exactly how everything fit together in a structure and was all logical. This is not the way that curiosity flies around the world. This is a very ordered, methodical approach, and it's one that, that Bacon really objected to. Because what we now call the scientific revolution, especially the emergence of the experimental sciences, which is what I concentrate on, was not about developing a scientific method. It was about shifting knowledge from a search for certain truths to the unknown. And as a result, Bacon rejected method. He actually compares them to torture devices, these kinds of graphs. What he wanted to do instead was to model knowledge onto conquest. So instead of having these kinds of pincers of method that show you how everything is organized and connected and logical and rational, his model is this kind of map, which kind of fades away into the blank space, which is where we are now on the northwest coast of North America, with his idea being that this is how we should imagine the shape of knowledge, and we should be heading for that blank space. And so he worked to develop a particular form of scientific masculinity that was based on the conquistador rather than on the university professor. And so this is why he cast the advancement of learning as tempting men to sail further beyond plus ultra to conquer new worlds. This is a reference to the columns of Hercules at the Straits of Gibraltar. They were placed there to warn Europe against having an empire across the seas, and had been adopted as the motto of the Habsburg Empire that was showing off how it had ignored the warning against hubris and was going to conquer the whole world. Bacon then adopts this for knowledge, saying that we should be just as hubristic and ambitious in knowledge and try to be conquistadors of knowledge just as much as we are of empire. And he invents various ways to do this. So one thing he invents, which is a term that we still use in academic parlance today, if not anywhere else, is desiderata, or the unknown parts of learning. And this is his method of pointing to these blank spaces, saying, we don't know this, we don't know this, we don't know this, we should shoot for it. And he publishes it as a catalog called the New World of Sciences, or the Desiderata. So rather than method, he bequeaths a colonial dynamic to knowledge that was entangled with actual colonialism, of which he is a big proponent, both in his time and for centuries thereafter. And so he and other people of his generation develop all of these tools of kind of invasion into the unknown that is supposed to be pushing knowledge more towards what is more probable and more likely, and more towards these knowledge targets that they identify, but never claiming to reach it. You're not aiming for truth in this system because truth is not available to you. You're aiming at most for what is beyond a reasonable doubt in a legal parlance. Bacon was a lawyer, and we can talk about the history of facts and law and how it all plays a role here. So some of the early modern genres that are invented and that we still use today and that I work on, are projects and essays, desiderata, hints, facts, journal articles, and citations. These are all novel in the early modern period and are all part of this idea of what Bacon calls broken knowledge that's broken away from a system and that is pushing towards goals while acknowledging that it will never reach the end. And the followers of Bacon, such as the naturalists who composed some of the big learned societies, such as the Royal Society in England, adopted this approach of the imperfect and the kind of conquest of the unknown. And that meant that you had to put knowledge not into an orb of learning, not into these structured, divinely authored crystalline spheres, but into very temporary structures. Boyle, whom you might know from Boyle's Law, calls these superstructures, and he says that they need to be looked on only as temporary ones, which though they may be preferred before any others as being the least imperfect, or if you please, the best in the kind that we yet have, yet are they not entirely to be acquiesced in as absolutely perfect or incapable of improvement. This is the idea that we don't have certain knowledge, we do not have scientia, we will never have scientia. Knowledge is always advancing and always changing, so any kind of model or system that you put into place, you have to recognize is temporary. It is not truth, it is a temporary system that could be overthrown, and as history of science has shown, has been overthrown many times. So one of the genres, we're familiar with journal articles and essays, so those we kind of recognize as scholarly genres, but one of the genres I really like to work on recently because I feel it has a great and important history and we don't think of it as important in this knowledge change, are hints. So they become darlings of this new field called experimental natural philosophy, which is the ancestor of all experimental sciences, because you hint when you cannot prove. You have a sense of something, like seeing through a cloud darkly is how it's defined in period dictionaries. So it's this like presentiment of great power in the region and potentiality, but you can't get a clear view of it, you cannot prove it. They are anti-methodical, so Boyle, for example, explaining in one passage why he isn't providing a method, argues that he can't because he knows how much more future discoveries and hints might make it more comprehensive. So it doesn't make sense to prematurely have a method that's just going to lock you in. Even the uses of experimental philosophy, which Boyle is very eager to point out, what we call the relationship between science and technology, is also based on hints or unproven hopes and assumptions of future power and profit. It's not proven anywhere that a science has a particular relationship to use over any other form of knowledge, but there was a cultural belief put upon this form of knowledge by figures like Boyle that it is hinting at this great power. And in particular, he has this list of hints of things useful to human life, which are projects that seem maybe impossible, but maybe they're not impossible. And his list actually has gone viral once the Royal Society displayed it during one of their anniversary years. It's a pretty good read, including attaining gigantic statures of human bodies, etc., pleasing dreams, various hallucinogenic drugs, it's all on there. So hints justified the publication of unproven incipient knowledge and laid accountability to others to take the hint. You can say, like, I'm hinting at this. If you don't make something of it, that's on you. And so, for example, Sir Isaac Newton did that when he publishes something in this early scientific journal. He says, I'm only publishing it for those people who know how to follow up on hints. If you don't understand me, that's because you don't get my hint. And this idea that there were certain individuals who were able to get hints is what the cult of scientific genius becomes built upon. So Newton, for example, and the myth of the apple, for which he gets this idea of gravity, the idea is that all people see apples falling all the time, but only Newton took a hint from the falling of the apple, and that's what scientific genius is. And even today, hints, much more than we think they do, play a huge role in the way we talk about science and talk about scientific discoveries and link what is actually being done in experiments to the claims that are made about what's being done in experiments. So if you look up hints in titles of articles from the journal Nature, you will just see a lot of articles which are hinting at various things. They can't prove it, but the hint is still very powerful in this realm. So, to conclude, I will suggest that science today still resembles curiosity more than it does science. We do not offer scientia, we do not offer certain knowledge. We use the term, and the term has cultural valence as offering certain knowledge, even though what it is doing remains probabilistic in experimental sciences. And it does not have a unique method. So here's a quote from the figure I'm focusing on in my next book, where he is pointing out that, in fact, all human-authored knowledge can really use basically the same tools and could really be called what he really loves, which is experimental natural philosophy. He says that one can take any type of human knowledge, weighed in the same two scales, that is, mature consideration and sufficient observation, and thus molded into a form that could be called experimental study or philosophy. No two cultures here. He's arguing that it can all be one. And in fact, the term scientist itself was coined on an analogy with artist in 1840, although it didn't become popular until much later. So this whole idea that there is an entity that's a scientist that is separate from other scholars or a unique science isn't really supported by much historical basis. Still today, the presumed special relationship between science and usefulness is a cultural assumption that's based on hints and the idea of advancing frontiers, I would argue, in ways that also tend to distract from harms that we know about that have been produced in the past. We look at the constant potential receding frontier of advancement rather than the history of what has happened. And early modern European cultural values of the conquistador still shape today's research persona in many ways. And so you might recognize things like aggression or territoriality, fame-seeking, hubris, impact upon society, and dynamic of advancing frontiers in a lot of rhetoric around research and around the research persona. So for me, it's not surprising that in our wider political landscape we are so disliked as academics if these are the kinds of values that we're seen as embodying. So I just want to ask a few questions to conclude of what would it look like if we instead considered the societal benefits of all knowledge, maybe ask society what they think the benefits are too, and what could new virtues of our knowledge look like? If we recognize that many of the cultural values of research right now have this colonial dynamic to them that they have not let go of for centuries, how might we decide to adopt new values? And we can all think of many, I think. These are some that are important to me, like care. Oh, first of all, epistemic humility, definitely extremely important. We are not scientia. We're just probable knowledge. There is a lot of ignorance. Care, attention, healing, collaboration, critical reasoning, generosity, and inspiration. And I look forward to being inspired by hearing about your values. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Nicolae. I'm an associate professor in environmental studies and philosophy. And definitely I want to start with a thank you note. Thank you note both to the OHC for organizing this event, to my panelists. You will see the ways in which there is intellectual kinship, to Dr. Keller and Dr. Smith, and last but not least, especially at this point, special thanks to Professor Pepes for, as he's leaving the leadership of the OHC, for his tenacity and for sort of continuing to create a space for a number of humanists to really sort of get the chance to shine. I want to make very much similar points to what Professor Keller has pointed out, hopefully 3 points, hopefully in 15 minutes. I want to tell you a story again about myths and about the question of disunity of science. I want to tell you about what I really want to mean by engaging with specificity, and a little bit more about my experience in collaborations with colleagues on campus. And I want to close with moving beyond and hopefully with sort of smaller pointers as to where the conversation can go into the future. This is something that we've already learned by now. There is an old myth about the unity of science. There is a clear sense in which we want as many facts as possible about the nature and universe, and hopefully we would want them to be linked. And philosophers who have spent time thinking about the unity of science have sort of pointed out that this is probably as old as ancient Greece, when even folks like Thales and Aristotle would note that in the metaphysics, that all things are from water and all things are going back to water. There was a robust sense of the unity of knowledge and the unity of this type of endeavor, and that sort of carried at least throughout the history of science. In many ways, the story that I want to tell you, and the quibble even with the title of our panel, which is really Science and the Humanities, I was one of those people that was deeply sort of inspired and informed by what got to be labeled the Stanford School, by a series of philosophers of science, whether one is thinking of Nancy Cartwright, of Jean Dupré, but also by a series of philosophers of science and historians of science, whether one thinks of the late Ian Hacking or Peter Gallison. And what were some of the points that those people were sort of putting in front of us? I think they had at least two interesting points. On the one hand, they were challenging the universality and uniformity of science, both on methodological grounds, but also on metaphysical grounds. And on the other hand, I think they were proposing models of local unity. They were assuming that there is a plurality of methods, and they were also assuming that there is a plurality of style of reasonings that would create, hopefully, multiple epistemic spaces. And for me, at least, intellectually speaking, one of the folks that had the most impact on the ways in which I continue to think about the relationship between the humanities and the sciences is John Dupré's 1995 book, The Disorder of Things, Metaphysical Foundation of the Disunity of Science. And I think Dupré is making a really interesting critique of the unity of science that has sort of three specific axes. On the one hand, he definitely deploys a critique against essentialism and the idea that there is no single way of classifying the world. If one were to put that positively, Dupré would say there are multiple ways of classifying the world into kinds. He's definitely setting up a critique against reductionism, the idea that the micro level is causally exhaustive, or if one were to put that positively, the assumption in the background is that there is equal reality and causal efficacy at various levels. And he's definitely putting a critique against epistemological monism. There's no single method as a criteria for scientificity. And more importantly, Dupré would say probably, there is no universal domain of applicability. So once you heard all of that, this is, I think, one of the conclusions that a lot of people would go. There's no such thing as science, and you heard it already. I mean, there is definitely a philosophical critique of the unity of science, and I think there's a tremendously interesting critique from the history of science. And I try to make this argument. My kid has a science fair tomorrow, and last night at dinner, he's 5 years old. Last night at dinner, I was like, there is no such thing as science. No, Papa, there is a science fair tomorrow. And I didn't work. I failed miserably at convincing him that there is no such thing as science. And why am I telling you? Probably I might be failing convincing you that there is no such thing as science. But I think for me, what's interesting is sort of highlighting an intellectual lineage that made a difference in my thinking, and especially something that led me to something else, to a future question, which is more like, what is the impact? If it were to be true that there is no such thing as science, what is the impact of the statement of the ways in which the humanities could engage with the sciences? And I think for me, this opens new venues for conversation, or what I think are more productive conversations to a certain degree. Because instead of trying to revive the old dinosaurs of the two cultures, there is such a thing as science, there is such a thing as the humanities, engaging with the specificity, I think, will create opportunities, both on the humanities side and on the sciences side, to learn more about our work. And I think in many ways we're fortunate, because there are tons of projects that are doing just that on our campus. I think in many ways, on the side of philosophy, there are many folks who are doing this, from my colleague Jacob, for example, who's thinking about dynamic behaviors of biomolecules, my colleague Ramon, my colleague Colin, my colleague Mark Johnson. In the environmental studies, there are a number of people who are constantly crossing the boundaries, from Stacy Alamo to Ashley Cordes. Oh, I'm sorry. I got too excited. And I want to pause for a second and sort of kind of push a little bit against the idea that it's only for humanists somehow important to engage with the humanities. I think I have a number of colleagues on the sciences side, plural, who are constantly engaging with humanists in some of the most productive ways, as you will hear soon from my colleague Brandon Bohannon, Lucas Silva, and so many others. To me, their work is inspiring, and what's inspiring about their work, it's again, not because they're engaging with science with capital S. That has little to do. To me, what's inspiring about it is again, the ways in which they're engaging with this idea of specificity, learning from each other within our own specificity. And in large part, I was extremely fortunate to be part of a collaboration with our colleague Brandon Bohannon. And it started by learning something about the human microbiome and the ways in which the human microbiome research were telling us a lot of things about ourselves, whether or not we had 10% human, whether or not we're only 3-to-1, and whether or not we're only about 0.5% human. But all those findings coming out of the human microbiome research were extremely interesting because they were definitely raising, I think, crucial questions about what it means to be an organism, what it means to have a genome. And all those questions, as a humanist, were absolutely exciting to me. And there is a clear sense in which some of those findings are genuinely transformative, especially from a genetic standpoint. If we take seriously the human microbiome from a genetic standpoint, I think we should be asking ourselves, what are we? Because at least from a genetic standpoint, I think Tom Insel is right. We're probably more microbial than humans. What did it mean in our collaboration with Dr. Bohannon? When we started working on some of those questions, we've seen at least two interesting trends in the literature. And we saw a sort of a form of awareness and a sort of excitement around the idea that there's tremendous diversity when it comes to thinking about our bodies, and at the same time, tremendous complexity. And in our work, at least, we saw two specific tendencies. On the one hand, some people want to say that we're not individuals, that we should completely rethink some of the categories that inform the grounds, not just of biology, but even further than that. And on the other hand, there were a bunch of people who were trying again to find the right framework by which we can think, or at least get the best predictions out of this conversation. As to whether or not the human microbiome is an organ view, as to whether or not the human microbiome is part of our immunity view, if the human microbiome will invite us to think of our bodies as superorganisms, or from an evolutionary perspective, thinking about holobionts, or if we should be thinking about our human microbiome as completely transforming our sense of self as an ecological community. In our collaboration with Brendan, I think we tried at least to do two things. On the one thing that we really worked as hard as possible was to generate a conceptual ecology. We really wanted all those people sort of invested in those conversations to pause for a second and think about how significant and how different at the same time those frameworks were in conceiving something as interesting and as important about our functioning of our bodies. One of the things, and hopefully we mimicked a little bit one of the virtues that Dr. Keller talked about, we really had a critical stance on it. We thought that probably most of those views were partial and probably wrong, but some of them were definitely interesting. And that was one of the directions that we took in our common publication. But it wasn't just enough for us to simply come back and say in our collaboration, here is the variety of ways by which we can understand the world. And I think this is one of those places where I think both of us have agreed that the relationship between the humanities and the sciences, plural on both sides, really sparked an interest. And that interest was definitely thinking about the importance of concepts and frameworks, thinking about the ways in which we can organize a conceptual space when we think about certain phenomena, and more importantly, thinking about the ways in which language frames any kind of possible intervention. Language as such is not innocent, and I don't mean innocent here in a moral way. Really, language captures something about our imagination. Because if we think about the human microbiome as an organ, most likely the form of intervention that we'll be thinking about, it's something that will look like a transplant. So it really matters the ways in which we name and we frame some of those phenomena. And I think this is the sort of appreciation that Brendan and I had about this conversation. If we think about ourselves as ecological communities, or if we think about ourselves as being superorganisms, what we really say in the background is that there is a porosity to the ways in which our bodies exist. And this porosity sort of invites us to bring things in if we had lost them. And in some way, this is what we're trying to do with probiotics in the background. So what is this? What at least are some of the things that we try to do in this collaboration? We're definitely advocating for something like an epistemic form of pluralism. And we close nonetheless our paper with what I think it's an important conversation as to whether or not there is more than just pluralism. And if there is something more than pluralism, what are some of those directions that sort of some philosophers have called metaphysical pluralism? And the ways in which we continue to think about ourselves as multi-species organisms, the ways in which us as multi-species organisms can exist into the world. The last point that I want to make about sort of the present time and also probably a little bit of the future is that in many ways, and I think this is definitely one of those points that the call for this panel captures, and it's a little bit more controversial to a certain degree, I think, but I really want to call this to our attention as scholars and as folks seriously thinking about some of those problems. As I was saying early on, one of my humble recommendations would be for specific engagement with the sciences plural, instead of trying to wake up one of those old mammoths. And within this specific engagement, to try to develop definitely a sense of humility about how difficult some of those challenges are. How do you move from specificity of learning and to collaboration? The road is long. It's long because there are many hurdles. How we think about us humanists collaborating with scientists is not always obvious for a variety of reasons. Precisely because, again, I think the challenges are obvious. We continue to think in specific ways about authorship in the humanities. We continue to think about specific ways about funding. It's really critical and difficult to find funding for such collaborations. And at the same time, they're onerous. They're not, especially for junior people, they're not obvious. I mean, there are hurdles to overcome. The last point that I want to make, and especially this is something that sort of caught my attention for a number of years, and to my fellow humanists, I think the call, as I mentioned, the call of the panel, I think it's right. We've been under siege for a while in the humanities. We've seen shrinking resources. We've seen structural inequities. And I think in many ways, all those things probably in some way have been giving us a normative upper hand in our relationship with the sciences. I see it in my classroom sometimes. I see it in faculty meetings. I see it in administration meetings, that sometimes humanists seem to believe that while we might not have the visibility or the resources we deserve, we're probably sometimes in a position where we can judge right from wrong. There is almost as if we could probably judge our colleagues on the sciences side as to whether or not they're on the right side of history. There is a sense in which the humanities, I think, especially in the more recent times, have invested in themselves with a sense of moral righteousness. And I'm not going to argue as to whether or not it's warranted. I mean, I have my opinions, and hopefully I want to hear your thoughts on this. But I would say that at least whenever we take on the humanities side that sort of moral attitude, I think it's at least counterproductive, maybe teensy-beensy, probably a little bit condescending. And my humble recommendation would be to find ways to engage with the specificity of science. And the same way we don't assume some kind of absolute epistemic superiority on the side of the sciences, hopefully the same way we find ways to undo some of the moral and political high ground that we've been taking on the humanities side. Needless to say, I continue to be extremely grateful to the Oregon Humanities Center for the space that they have created over the years for scholars like me, and to all my collaborators. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Smith. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies, assistant professor in Black Studies here at UO. I'm really excited to share some of my work with you today. I've tried to pack a lot into a very short presentation, so here goes. I'm a scholar of US Black literatures, Black studies, and the health humanities, who broadly analyzes representations of the biological interior in Black art and culture. Increasingly, my research interests have grown to include African American visual and performance art, as well as the study of museums, so I'm kind of all over the place. I'm working on a book manuscript called Vivified Viscerality, Bioscience and the Black Interior in US Black Literature and Sculpture that asks, what use is biology to the Black artist? In the brief time I have today, I'd like to share two of my objects of study to demonstrate how I think about the relationship between the sciences and the humanities, both plural. Before diving into these examples, though, let me provide some highly condensed and majorly simplified context for my work, including a couple ethical sticking points that have historically prompted several Black studies scholars in general and Black literary critics in particular to disavow the sciences. The first sticking point is the dangerous perpetuation of the belief that race is biological. While still widely believed in many medical and scientific communities, Black studies scholars have long denounced any biological basis for race and have chosen instead to focus on racism as a social phenomenon. Scientific racism, eugenics, unethical human subject experimentation, medical discrimination, and insufficient care have historically made science and medicine seem like desolate wastelands for these scholars. While this perspective has been changing in recent years, it's still necessary to recognize that there's more left to be understood about Blackness's embodiments. As an interdisciplinary humanist, I aim to sit with and illuminate the discomfort that attends putting race, science, and culture in the same sentence. Doing so might initially seem at odds with Black studies political projects, but my research has convinced me that pursuing Black creatives' perspectives on and manipulations of bioscientific imagery opens up new ways of thinking about Black people's engagements with biology and the racialized body. As Black literary and cultural studies scholars turned away from associating race with biology, they often turned towards insisting on Black humanity. These scholars sought to refute the assumed debasement of being associated with animals and thereby made inferior. In their attempts to garner respect by asserting a maligned humanity, these thinkers brought us to a second sticking point: the scholarly fixation on Black psychological and emotional experience as uniquely meaningful proof of one's humanness. While significant, overemphasizing psychology and emotion upholds a hierarchical Enlightenment vision of the human that ultimately furthers racist logics. Furthermore, it eclipses other forms of racialized interiority, like the Black biological interior, that might offer alternative definitions and valuations of the human. In my work, I conduct close readings of literary and artistic texts to bring to the surface the Black biological interior and to demonstrate how select Black artists use the biosciences as creative material. Beyond the fear of perpetuating the falsehood of race as biology, and beyond the fear of contributing to dehumanization by foregoing psychology and emotion, a third sticking point has kept Black literary and cultural studies scholars away from engaging the sciences. In neoliberal universities, humanities fields are routinely disparaged and defunded, leaving scholars feeling undervalued and deprioritized compared to the sciences. Institutional investments in the sciences and professional schools and divestment from humanities programs make some humanities scholars opposed to engaging non-humanistic methods or fields. These scholars shy away from cross-disciplinary exchange in an attempt to prove that their humanistic methods and sources produce quality, indispensable research too. While understandable, this perspective keeps many of my literary and cultural studies peers in disciplinary silos. Being in the multidisciplinary field of Black studies has enabled me to hold on to my interests in scientific and social scientific subjects, allowing me to develop a sensitivity to science's permeations into creative forms. While I'm just as vulnerable as other thinkers to the sticky points I've described, my work aims to negotiate around them, and in the process reveal the shapes that block our view of Black creative engagements with science and medicine. For the most part, the writers and visual artists that I study are not trained scientists or physicians. They take creative liberty with bioscientific imagery and medical practice. but their layperson interpretations are precisely what makes them interesting to me. All of that being said, today I'll be presenting a couple brief close readings of a creative text written by a scientifically trained physician, the anti-colonial philosopher, psychiatrist, and cultural theorist Frantz Fanon. Although the text was originally written in French, and although Fanon was not an American, Richard Philcox's 2008 translation of Fanon's 1952 The Lived Experience of the Black Man chapter proves to be a helpful guide for thinking about US Black creatives' bioscientific approaches to confronting racism. Fanon's autoethnographic chapter narrates a series of encounters where he struggles with his racialization as he grapples with what it means to be Black. Philcox's translation emphasizes Fanon's familiarity with the medico-scientific realm. In it, Fanon is depicted as a scientific researcher and tactician who registers the ontological and material violence of racialization through bodily sensations like nausea, disorientation, and shivering. The repeated denigration of his racial interpolation makes Fanon, at first, unable to discover the feverish coordinates of the world, leaving him overwhelmed and feeling nausea. Not nauseous, as if the corporeal state had an internal origin, but nausea, a state enacted by the conditions of the outside world. Fanon's emotional desire to assert himself as a Black man in a white supremacist world only leaves him physically and psychically disoriented. His aching heart makes his head spin, keeping him in a state of bewilderment and nauseated discomfort. Anti-Black racism's physiological imprint is visible not only in the somatic experiences themselves, but also in how those experiences put Fanon in relation with others. A white child's racist misinterpretation of Fanon's trembling reinforces the unequal power dynamics between them that cause Fanon to live in a perpetual and varied state of corporeal vulnerability. The Negro is trembling. The Negro is trembling with cold, the cold that chills the bones. The lovely little boy is trembling because he thinks the Negro is trembling with rage. Unlike the white child, Fanon's discomfort is caused by the reality of a cold that chills the bones, both cool environmental temperatures and the material danger of emotional coldness from the allegedly harmless white child and its mother. Even without a white person present, the specter of anti-Blackness causes trembling. Later, Fanon describes himself as a Negro physician becoming a nervous wreck, shaking at the slightest alert, because he knew that if the physician made one false move, it was over for him and for all those who came after him. Fanon's shaking and hypervigilance, whether initiated by fear or the concerted effort to stay controlled in his movements, is caused by the awareness of the long-standing, widespread consequences of error under anti-Blackness that would generalize individual failure as collective Black incompetence. For Fanon, trembling becomes a literary trope for communicating not only the embodied realities of living under anti-Black white supremacy, but also the linkages and dynamics between himself and both Black and white people. Ultimately, these bodily experiences prompt Fanon to theorize an epidermal racial schema. Is that here? No. Okay. Epidermal racial schema that emerges as a consequence of his racialization, or, as he describes it metaphorically, the peeling, stripping of his skin, causing a hemorrhage that left congealed Black blood all over his body. He refigures his socially meaningful skin color as a direct product of racist violence. As Fanon is hailed by a white child and the rest of the non-Black world, he experiences the slow construction of his self as a body in a spatial and temporal world that results in a definitive structuring of his self and the world. Definitive because it creates a genuine dialectic between his body and the world. Fanon only sees himself through the epidermal racial schema because his own personal bodily schema, attacked in several places, collapses, giving way to the epidermal racial one as his body is returned to him, spread-eagled, disjointed, redone, draped in mourning on this white winter's day. For Fanon, representations of the internal racialized body and its processes serve as the analyzable evidence of injustice and as a conduit through which racial power struggles can be articulated. Throughout the chapter, Fanon positions himself, especially in Philcox's translation, as a medical professional and a researcher attempting to understand racialization through scientific means. Fanon remarks, "I cast an objective gaze over myself, discovered my Blackness, my ethnic features, deafened by cannibalism, backwardness, fetishism, racial stigmas, and slave traders." Encountering these racist associations with his ethnic features, Fanon describes himself becoming a censor as he sets about enthusiastically making a checklist, investigating his surroundings, and interpreting everything on the basis of his findings. In response to racist claims to his irrationality and inferior rationality, Fanon asserts, "I tested my heredity. I did a complete checkup of my sickness." He chooses medico-scientific measures to refute racism's hold over him. Fanon describes himself using any effective tetanization when denied his manhood by white men who exhibit, in Fanon's words, effective ankylosis. Further describing racialization in medico-scientific terms, Fanon writes, "The white gaze, the only valid one, is already dissecting me. Once their microtomes are sharpened, the whites objectively cut sections of my reality. I see in this white gaze that it's the arrival not of a new man, but of a new type of man, a new species, a Negro, in fact." Interestingly, the solution to this racial dissection is also imagined through tongue-in-cheek use of medico-scientific terminology. Fanon says, "For some years now, certain laboratories have been researching for a denegrification serum. In all seriousness, they have been rinsing out their test tubes and adjusting their scales and have begun research on how the wretched black man could whiten himself and thus rid himself of the burden of this bodily curse. All the while, these same scientists only reluctantly admit that the Negro was a human being. In vivo and in vitro, the Negro was identical to the white man, same morphology, same histology." Explaining racial difference to themselves in biological terms, Fanon states, "Next to the sex-linked, scientists discovered the racial-linked portion of chromosomes." By utilizing medico-scientific terminology and describing himself as a scientific researcher, Fanon caricatures racists who use scientific means to uphold the racial status quo. Importantly, Fanon does not do this to denounce science. He is scientifically trained, and he was a practicing physician, but rather to denounce the way that racism influences scientific practice and becomes codified as an acceptable science in itself. Fanon's medico-scientific imagery focuses readers on the ludicrousness of a biologically raced body and identifies Black people's anatomy and physiology as terrains upon which racial power struggles are waged. Ultimately, scientific means cannot fully explain any anti-Black racism. It is creative writing that enables Fanon to adequately address his racialization. By the end of the chapter, he engages creative writing by Black writers from across the globe to diagnose the racial situation and portray Black life amidst racism's denial of Black vibrancy. Writing allows Fanon, like the writers he cites, to present his Black self in an alternative light. Writing allows him to display the fragments of himself put together by another me, after their corporeal and ontological violence causes Fanon to metaphorically explode. In other words, writing about the body and its physiological experiences helps Fanon stabilize and gather himself amidst racist disjointedness. Furthermore, this metonymic writing enables Fanon to communicate a gathered self to others. I offer this close reading of Fanon's chapter for 3 reasons. First, the chapter highlights Black creative writers' thematic interest in science and medicine. Second, the chapter presents a self-reflexive meditation on the importance of using creative writing as a means for chronicling how the body is made to feel Black and how people navigate that blackening. Lastly, the chapter exemplifies the utility of bioscientific imagery for representing and contesting racialization. Taking Fanon's writings as a springboard, my in-progress book, manuscript, analyzes 20th and 21st century representations of the internal biological body in US Black novels, poetry, and sculpture. My project recognizes the biological interior as a fundamental contributor to political consciousness. I argue that artists mobilize somatic depictions of Black life to critique anti-Black racism and expose its evolving techniques of domination. By analyzing the activated sympathetic nervous system in William Attaway's 1941 novel, Blood on the Forge, brain injury in Ralph Ellison's 1952 novel, Invisible Man, and nasty secretions and movements in Jane Cortez's 1982 poetry collection, Fire Spitter, I show how physiological states teach characters about their social positionalities and communicate strategies for surviving and resisting total subjugation. I examine the Black biological body and its processes in the context of a Black feminist tradition that is skeptical of biology and biocentrism, even as it proves the hermeneutic of the flesh that grounds my study. I extend Black feminist theorizations of the flesh by focusing on the bodily insides, by centering physiology and arguing for bioscientific imagery's manipulability. I assert that Black creatives self-consciously invoke biology to rewrite racialized embodiment and refute race's biological justifications. I attend to the creative representations of bodily processes that often go unseen by others and unnoticed by the self. Literature and visual art work to make perceivable processes and sensations that ordinarily happen subconsciously. In doing so, these creative works transpose the senses onto one another. A proprioceptive, interoceptive, and visceroceptive feeling is transferred into something, or translated into something that can be seen by an audience. Both literature and sculpture engage in this transposition by capturing physiological movement into a static image or images. These images may suggest movement, but in reality, they function more like a series of photographs than a movie. The static visualization of bodily processes invites interpretation, not only of the biological accuracy of the rendering, but also of the symbolic functions of the depiction. Close reading enables me to analyze the Black body's symbolism, to both decode what Black feminist literary critic Hortense Spillers calls the hieroglyphics of the flesh, and to expose how such hieroglyphics work. As a form of writing, hieroglyphs are images that communicate linguistically. Spillers' analytical treatment of the flesh as hieroglyph makes close reading a particularly useful method for analyzing creative portrayals of the Black biological interior. Where visual art presents the image of the body, literature asks readers to construct the image of the body in their mind's eyes. This process of construction calls attention to itself and invites readers to consider how they construct ideas about living people based on their perceptions of bodies. Furthermore, by calling attention to the mental construction of the body, literary texts demonstrate that the biological interior, like its exterior, contains information about the social world in which these bodies live. While the visual operates differently in text-based and non-text-based artworks, my brief analysis of King Cobra's sculptures provide a useful contrast to the literature. This contrast helps to clarify how the Black interior affects readers. Rather than use the sculpture to illustrate the dynamics or aesthetic decisions that the writers make, the plastic art foregrounds its own aesthetic techniques, whose differences from the literary texts illuminate the formal stakes of representing the Black biological body. Observing Cobra's techniques for rendering Blackened biology reveals, among other things, the range of artistic choices possible when rendering the flesh. I utilized a transmedial approach to engage Cobra's sculptures. This approach has helped me identify the possible spaces of and techniques for transforming biology that the writers use to chronicle, interpret, and communicate bodily experience under a racist regime. As a sculptor, tattoo artist, performance artist, and podcast host, King Cobra, also known as Doreen Lynette Garner, is no stranger to fleshy materiality. While Cobra's sculptures of ravaged Black body parts and diseased white skin often receive most attention, her zoomed-in depictions of the cellular body teach viewers how to engage her subject matter and materials. Take, for instance, Cobra's 2016 sculpture, Sampled Skin Cells with Melanin 3. This piece perplexes viewers with its size. At 11 by 14 inches, it is both much larger than what it purports to represent, a cluster of skin cells on a microscope slide, and much smaller than Cobra's other mixed media sculptures. The contradiction in size lures viewers into peering closely at the yellow glass slide affixed to the wall. Further examination reveals a layered silicone form embedded in the glass. The artificial silicone's texture, folded, watery, splotchy, suggests organic material. The sculpture's coloring calls to mind bodily substances like blood, bile, pus, mucus, flesh, feces, and decay. Swarovski crystals, beads, mica flakes, and hair fragments embedded in the model provide organic-looking texture and represent cellular structures, while simultaneously reminding viewers that they are not looking at an actual sample of the human body's largest organ. The silicone form and embedded materials only give the impression of looking at a slightly fuzzy image of cellular bodies through a microscope. What can viewers discover by peering through Cobra's microscope? To see clearer, viewers must consider the artwork's title, namely the specification that the skin cells on display are with melanin. Furthermore, viewers must keep in mind that this sculpture is the third in a series of slides depicting increasing levels of the brown and black silicone representing melanin and melanosomes. 3 are there. Out of the 3 sculptures, this one has the highest concentration of brown and black pigment, suggesting the darkest skin tone of the 3 samples. Because melanin has become a mark of pride for many Black people, viewers might presume that they're looking at a Black person's skin cells and marvel at the cell's abstract beauty hanging like a landscape painting on the wall. However, herein lies another perplexing tension. Each of the 3 sculptures contains the brown and black silicone and is titled with melanin. Are these 3 samples from different places on the same person's body? Are they samples from 3 different people with different skin tones who would all be racialized as black? Or are they samples from a variety of racial groups? After all, different shades and concentrations of melanin exist in all humans without albinism, even if black populations currently champion melanin as a group identifier. The cell's indecipherable identities, racial and otherwise, stand in opposition to the microscope's cultural status as tool for objective verification. The image that comes through is not as clear as it may appear at first glance. Blackness cannot be found in the biological. Biology requires a narrative, be it the title or supplemental text, to make sense of what the viewer sees before them. There's no quantifiable number of melanosomes or amount of melanin that create a strict black, non-black cutoff. Cobra's organic shapes on rigid glass work hard to convince the viewer of their naturalness, but the meaning of the melanin inside the sample is not natural. In its ambiguity, Cobra's sculpture encourages viewers to reconsider the social weight attached to biological structures like melanin. She also invites viewers to acknowledge the role that narrative plays in the interpretation of phenotypic characteristics. In the process, Cobra calls into question the viewer's sight that transposes a societal racial logic onto the internal body, racializing it even as the exact racial status of the sample is unclear. Blackness is something that happens in the viewer's vision, a vision that instrumentalizes objective science and advanced technology. In braving the hostile realm of the biological as a channel for promoting reflection on race and racism, the creatives I study, like King Cobra, engage science on their own terms. Their creative work calls attention to its production. In making biology and the medico-scientific world its subject, art exposes the createdness of scientific ways of viewing the world. Visual art might make it easier to see the relationship between the artist and science as their creation, but literature too provides those insights when physiology is read closely. Humanistic perspectives and approaches enable scholars like me to investigate the social roles of science, its ethics, its historical contexts, its consequences. Furthermore, studying literature and visual art enables me to engage Black people's interactions with and transformations of science. Doing so centers Black populations that have traditionally been exploited by scientific knowledge and practice. More importantly, analyzing US Black cultural production enables me to investigate how and why Black creatives respond to racism by co-opting scientific and medical imagery. Instead of treating Black communities like passive recipients of unjust treatment and racist ideology, humanistic methods record Black creatives' strategies for resisting anti-Blackness. Thank you.
So let me grab this microphone. Make sure it's on. Questions for the panel? Okay.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful set of talks. I have 2 questions. I'll try to make them as brief as possible. One is for Vera, the other one is for Nicolae. Sorry, Dr. Smith, I didn't have a question for your beautiful presentation. So the first one for Vera is, I'm thinking that insofar as epistemic humility entails the acknowledgement of human limitations, of fallibility, as well as a critique of pure human reason as sufficient to attain knowledge of our universe, then wouldn't Francis Bacon be the father of epistemic humility, since he was the first one to acknowledge that previous attempts to understand the world, like Aristotle's syllogisms, pure logic, etc., were just completely fallible, and that we couldn't trust humans, therefore we needed to invent a different external method. So wouldn't he be the first one to say we should be epistemic humble, right? So that's the first question. And for Nicolae, just really quickly, the assertion of that there's no one method in science does not necessarily imply that there's no unity in science, right? So you could have completely different methods insofar as they're all sharing one aim or one goal or one value or one set of axiological commitments to certain values. You could still say that there's a unity to science. So my question is, can't normative and axiological commitments be a unitary force that distinguishes science from other epistemic endeavors? Thank you.
Okay, you should probably start a timer because I could go on this question for a really, really long time. It's a great question. And one of the places to start, I think, is the who is the we when we're talking about humans and epistemic humility. So what Bacon wants to do is point to the scholars as the people who are fallible, right? So they're the ones who have constructed these systems, who are teaching scientia in the university as though they have access to knowledge. And Bacon, who is not an academic but a failed politician, is attempting to focus on another group of people. That other group of people are gentlemen like himself, former military nobility that now no longer have a social function. And he's suggesting to them, you don't have to listen to the professors. They are fallible. They don't have the key. We're going to create a new approach, which is conquest. So what he is doing is, instead of searching outside of the human condition, trying to elevate above it to something beyond, he is now grounding all knowledge within human passions and desires in a very, because he's a politician, savvy political way. He's got lots of strategies. For example, his design of a gallery, which has, on one hand, statues of inventors, and on the other, empty pedestals. So you can imagine yourself being on there, right? So he's really thinking like a politician about human passions as how knowledge is produced and trying to manipulate that for further advance. So who's humble here? The people who are advanced upon, the disciplines that are advanced upon, etc. So yes, probabilism and an aversion to absolute truth is going to be a main part of his one branch of what he's doing. He in fact actually, this is an aside, too much detail. He in fact actually wants to discover metaphysical forms and therefore have access to absolute truth, but he never, does that. But that is his ultimate, what he would like to achieve. So he would like that, but doesn't get there. The next generation, so I wrote about that in my book that came out in April. Interlopers, these people who were aggressively ambitious, who denied all access to absolute truth and therefore had the whole world as their oyster. If no one has access, I might as well take it all, which is kind of the attitude. My next book is then going back to academics saying, well, academics, how do you respond to this? And those are people who then try to create research disciplines out of this conquistadorial dynamic. And those were the ones that were really foregrounding epistemic humility in a way that was trying to differentiate themselves from the Baconian dynamic of colonialism. Black skin is a great example. So the person that I'm focusing on orchestrated the first anatomical study of black skin and had his colleague write a 200-page study of it, in which they made the argument that there is no natural basis for differentiating humans based on skin color, because skin color is just a play of the light of corpuscles that are invisible. And therefore, the argument that people should be enslaved based on skin color is a distortion by merchants. Boyle is arguing that slave-based sugar plantations in Barbados are as an example of how experimental natural philosophy is useful to the public interest, because that's obviously in the public's benefit. Right, so I see you looking, bemused, as one might. My point here being that these are two people who you could say, the academic and Boyle, share a lot. They're both situating themselves as experimental natural philosophers. They both think that knowledge is probabilistic. They're both opposed to system and the idea that the Aristotelian sciences offer a key. They're both looking at human authorship of all knowledge and not trying to escape from the human condition because they think it's fallible. Boyle is adopting the status of, because I'm a fellow of the Royal Society and experimental natural philosopher and situated above other people in society, even if I don't have access to absolute truth, I do get to say what's in the public interest. And I do get to say what should be supported by the state. And I do get to say what's the relationship between knowledge production and use. And I get to hint that it's huge, even if I don't prove it. Meyer says, because I'm fallible, and because we're all fallible, I'm going to divide between use and knowledge. I think that because we're so fallible, if we make this tight connection between our research and our application, we're going to be distorting our arguments in science. And we're going to be making claims like scientific-based racism, which is what gets developed in later generations. And that is a distortion of what anatomy shows. So therefore, because of human fallibility, I'm going to carve out a liberal discipline in the academy that is a research discipline and that is not going to be like laying claims to that kind of authority. So there's different forms of authority, and there's different groups of people that, and different institutional settings in which these two versions of probabilistic knowledge are developed.
Thank you. Short answer, I think there is a clear sense that most of the philosophers of science that I sort of had on the board were probably really putting an argument against this global view of science, the one big, and they will definitely assume lower levels of kind of unification. So one of the ways in which even Dupré ends his book basically by saying, I think of the sciences as being unified in the same way that Wittgenstein is thinking about family resemblance categories, right? He ends the book by saying, I think there are certain kind of virtues, he calls them, you know, pluralistic epistemology that will help us in a way sort of carve out spaces, but there's going to be a lot of overlap. The domains will not be absolutely perfectly carved out. But yes, there are forms of unity that without a doubt, even folks who are sort of against or at least the people who are putting the disunity of science arguments up, there are definitely forms of unity that they would want to save, but definitely not the global one, right? Definitely not the global one, yeah.
So Isaac Newton famously said, non fingo hypotheses, I do not form hypotheses, because hypotheses were considered extremely anti-scientific. So hypotheses come from Aristotelian forms of logic that the new experimental sciences were opposing. So hints are what Newton formed, and queries would be two different ways that people would pose questions. So I would encourage us all to move away from this, like this standardized form of hypothesis. I think that the science fair, I know we're being facetious, and my daughter also has a science fair that she worked on like all weekend presentation on Wednesday. But the science fair model actually has a ton to blame for the way that we think about science today. As far as I can tell, like one of the ways that our current textbook versions of the scientific method, which by the way, I have looked at the textbooks we even use at the college level here, and it does get repeated in our intro science classes over and over and over again using scientific evolution, et cetera. So it's also in our university level education. But the textbooks for sure that are being used to prepare the students for the science fairs date from the early 20th century. John Dewey was engaged in a reform of education that was going to be project-based, thus science fair-based. And he's not really to blame. I went to look up how Dewey discusses it, and it was actually fairly sophisticated. But this always happens in this active translation, right? When that went from Dewey's theory of how you should teach project-based science to the classroom, you then get these manuals for teachers where it's teach them this step-by-step scientific method. That's where it comes from. So it comes from the science fair and ways that are hugely impacting the way we think about knowledge today. So the science fair is a big topic.
Anybody else want to respond to that? Any other questions? Oh.
Hello, so this is a question for everyone. So we work at institutions where we experience and complain about this division, and we keep perpetuating it with the structures we have in place. What is it that we can do to change those structures and work towards that unity?
Just off the top of my head, I'm brand new here, so I am not at all qualified to diagnose the problem and provide a solution. But one thing that we could potentially do is recognize that there aren't, like, that divide has always been a falsehood. So I think something that has been interesting for me is to go back and look at early 20th century, late 19th century writers and artists, and how Black writers and artists who were not trained in the university, who didn't have any kind of scientific training necessarily, have really astute observations about physiology, anatomy, about the nature of science, the nature of knowledge. And that's just something that people weren't expecting of Black writers and artists at the time. And so, at least for me, it's a reminder that that kind of separation that says, okay, science is here and art is here has always been false.
Well, I find myself guilty of what Nicolae was talking about, of being a tad condescending and declaring a morally superior vantage point, so I should probably not be doing that. Yes. So I'll take that seriously. But I do think that one of the things we can do is, as much as possible, talk to each other. This is why we're in a university. We're called a university because we're supposed to be the universe of learning. Goes back to the globe, right? But the point is, we are here all together in the same institution, and we do not talk to each other very often. I try my best to go around and give my spiel. I've visited Jabbo's department in geography. I talk to physics. So I go around, I talk to physics about the unknown, and they said, we know about the unknown. Yeah. So try to talk to each other, you know, because we are all passionate about what we do, and truly passionate people truly want to learn about learning, and are eternal students, and they want to learn about your discipline, and they want to learn about your methods, and we need to have those conversations more often. So we have to get out of our little areas and be a part of a larger university and enjoy the fact that we are privileged enough to have these people pursuing these different fields all together. It didn't have to be this way, right? There was a time when it looked like the university was just going to go away as an institution, and we would just have, say, beer brewing institutes. Those were a big deal in the late 19th century, right? Just very industrial. We could just have industrial-oriented institutes. That could be what people do, you know, and then they go get a job. So we should feel lucky that this kind of institution still does, for now, exist, and we should keep it existing by taking advantage of talking to each other. And making sure that when we do so, we allow each other to doubt each other's epistemic bases is the main thing. So I'm not saying let's go to the sciences and say, how do I apply science in my classroom, in my humanities classroom, or vice versa, but how do you think about knowledge? What's the shape of knowledge in your field? You know, what do you think about how much knowledge there is in the world and the fact that nobody is looking at it all and nobody is thinking about, you know, the areas that we're not talking about? These are big questions. If we're not asking these questions, who's going to be asking these questions? Nobody. So we should be asking them of each other.
I couldn't agree more with my fellow panelists. I would humbly add that without a doubt, this is not just an individual sort of effort. I think the individual efforts are significant, are required. We have structural issues. I mean, this is one of those things, and we should be recognizing them, and we should be talking about them, and we should have some sort of find a way to have a more collective decision-making over those structural issues. And it's definitely some of those structural issues will continue to be with us for a longer time. But my hope is that, and I know that it happens on both sides. I sometimes, sort of take that position. We teach critical reasoning in philosophy. Please take philosophy classes. I know that my scientist colleagues are critical. I mean, it's not, but sort of engaging within some of those virtues that Dr. Keller put on one of the last slides, I think it's without a doubt a really good way to start undoing some of those differences. Yeah.
Other questions? Oh, wait. Okay.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the panelists, what would it, like a thought experiment, what would it be like to present what you just presented today, let's say in the library or the conference room or the Phil Knight Center for Accelerated Research? I mean, we are really comfortable here in this beautiful room, and this is where everything happens, except that most of the audience familiar with the room and you familiar with the room, what would that be like to suddenly be on the other side of campus in this brand new facility where I've never set foot because I've never been invited, I don't know what's there, I don't know who works there, I don't know what it looks like, and I don't know anything about it, the first thing about it. So I'm just wondering, can we consider, to go back to Herida's question, what can we do? Could we flip spaces? That is, we have scientists here, and could some of us be out there and see what that's like and engage with the scientists who, I'm assuming, are there in their labs.
It is worth pointing out that not all scientists are on Knight campus. I mean, Knight campus actually doesn't exclude just humanists. They tend to actually carve out, or at least they carved out a space that sort of, it has its own boundaries that a number of folks on what they would recognize themselves on the sciences side don't participate in it. So it's true. We tend to be on this side of the campus, which is further away, yes.
I'd be absolutely delighted to give a talk in that space. Let me preface that by saying that this is the room where I gave my job talk, so I'll never be comfortable in this room. But yeah, I've asked to go speak at the Knight campus. It so far hasn't happened. But I will say that they reached out to me. So several faculty reached out to me as part of an initiative they're starting there. They asked me to teach a particular class, the history of beer. So I'm like, yes, you are asking me to teach a class. Scientists are asking for history. I am there. So I made this class. I'm pretty proud of it. And 4 Knight campus faculty attended for most of the term. I'm thinking they just got busy towards the end, and I didn't, insult them too much in the way I was presenting, like the capitalist and colonial history of beer. But there's an example where there has been actually interest from that side of the aisle, and we just need to build more and more of those. One of the problems, I'm afraid, is that I don't want to, be a snob again, and critique especially ethics too much. But what I found is that the Knight campus is very aware of the need to have ethics, and that ethics is sufficient engagement. And I think we need to have engagement that's on a more epistemic level about what are the projects that we're engaged in, what kinds of knowledge are we pursuing. And I am hoping that we are not always just, as Nicolae suggested, poo-pooing the scientists, but that there are things that we're saying that could be inspiring, and that scientists could see that we can, in fact, help improve knowledge making that they're engaged in, rather than just tell them that they are doing things the wrong way. That would be my hope. I do know other campuses where this does happen, and I had a speaker in this room in November named Jenna Tan, really interesting, who is in an engineering school, and she is directing a new minor in human-centered engineering. And I think that's kind of the approach that we should really be thinking about and looking at on this campus.
I just have a brief comment. In answer to your question, I've really been thinking about something that you'd said, that there's kind of a need for epistemological openness on all sides, because when I think about, imagine going to the Knight campus, or imagine talking to a room of scientists, I imagine people picking apart and saying, like, that's not accurate, that's not accurate, that's not how that actually works, this is not the description, these are not the terms that we use anymore, or what have you. And I think for me, something that would be exciting to share would be to push into that and say, well, is there something valuable still about inaccuracy in that representation? Is there something valuable about thinking with how someone might change the need for accuracy into something else? Like how, so yeah, anyway. So this just goes back to saying that I think there's, on both sides of the aisle, we would need to be open to a difference in valuing what is true knowledge and what is like accuracy and what are we really aspiring towards. Because when you do that, then yeah, new relationships emerge. That's all I was gonna say.
I'm coming to you, Colin, because I saw that hand before.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for great presentations. I put my hand up before Fabienne, and my question kind of got scooped a little bit in your answers, but let me try anyway. And maybe I can do this by kind of pushing a little bit on my esteemed colleague, Dr. Morar's critique of a certain conception of moral judgment that sometimes operates in the humanities, and as Nicolae himself knows, this is something that I tend to share, having published an article titled Critique Beyond Judgment, so this kind of beyond judgment language I'm on board with. But I wanted to kind of push back on it a little bit, perhaps somewhat hypothetically, and to ask all three panelists if we can maybe be more precise about the kinds of, the unique, or relatively unique, kinds of critical reflectiveness, and maybe especially ethical and social reflectiveness that the humanities can bring. I mean, definitely I don't think moral righteousness has much of a place in academia most of the time, though it has a place in other parts of the world. And you know, certainly humanists, and Nicolae, I take this to be part of your point, we don't have some kind of default claim on moral truth or moral knowledge that our colleagues in the natural sciences don't have. You know, there's no reason to think that we're like better people, for instance, than they are. However, there is pretty good reason to think, and I think overwhelming positive evidence in favor of thinking that humanists spend much more of their professional lives reflecting on social and ethical implications than do natural scientists, on average. Not, you know, as a class, but on average. You know, there's certain prominent exceptions, like Stephen Jay Gould is, you know, perhaps like this one that's most comes to mind for me of, you know, somebody in the natural sciences who really did go all the way with the questions of ethics and social impacts in ways that all of us in the humanities should be inspired by. But on average, you know, your average tenured faculty member here on campus, I think you're gonna have, you know, let me state it more strongly. There absolutely will be more experience and practice and all kinds of professional incentive in favor of ethical and social self-reflection. I mean, that's just what our disciplines do, by and large. Not entirely, but by and large, whereas there's not that incentive structure in place in the natural sciences as much. And maybe to particularize that, I can say, you know, I definitely am committed to that claim in the context of the sciences I know best, which are computer science and so-called data science. But I would think it's probably true of all the natural sciences. So, you know, is that, I guess, let me take this into a question. Is there some way of practicing ethical self-reflectiveness in a kind of non-righteousness mode that we can contribute, and what does that look like? Or maybe the sort of self-reflectiveness is not the right angle on it. I'd be curious what you all think is the right angle and how we can contribute that and what that kind of contribution maybe looks like.
I'm okay with moral righteousness. So I grew up in a different intellectual culture. I grew up in ultra-Orthodox Judaism where, you know, the idea is that learning is really the salvation of the world, and it's like why we exist on earth. I am now an atheist. However, I do consider myself still to be a devout intellectual in the sense that I do think that we have a mission in the university to fulfill. And I do think that it should be making us better people when we do it. You know, the university rejected moral righteousness in the 20th century because this kind of Victorian value system that the university was transmitting was recognized to be actually just a stand-in for colonialism and classism. And so, yes, we need to be always critical of that. But I don't think that we should have thrown out the whole idea that learning actually does serve a social and personal role in making us better, because I think it should. I think that what we practice in the classroom of listening to each other, of listening to reason, of practicing attention, all those things should actually be making us into better people, and they should be making our society better societies and healthier and more just societies. And that's really a mission that we should be serving. I don't think we should be giving up on that mission. And I think that you're right, that I think that a lot of what we do, especially in a small seminar setting, can train those practices of attention. Most of all is what's needed in our current society. We are just being ripped apart by distraction right now. you know. So I think practicing those are what we are good at in certain settings in the humanities, and that we should embrace and we should announce and advertise to the world the fact that we do have this function for ourselves, for our students, and for society. And that could be appealing maybe to scientists as well, you know, thinking about that and thinking about the reverse, that it is possible that there are practices of publication and reward strategies in various fields that do lead to certain behaviors that maybe we should question how much we should be pursuing them. One virtue I didn't put up there, which I think I should have, is thrift. Thrift, you know, it comes from thriving, and it suggests a certain kind of thriving society, and a society that is not expending and creating a huge extraction kind of view of resources, extractive view of resources. Humanities are way more thrifty than the sciences. I think we can all agree.
Yeah, I feel that I'm slightly pessimistic about it, maybe because I'm being asked to think about tenure and the future of joining the academia. But I think there would have to be a lot of things changed on the side of like how your work is valued in order for us to really change the culture of what we're doing here. I think I hear humility and I say that's like such a goal for us all, but how does one enact humility when you're being asked to make an argument? And how does one enact humility when you're being asked to like put yourself in conversation with others and you're asking your students to put themselves in conversation with others, which is a project of aligning and disaligning. And I think there's something there that has to change in order for an alternative to present itself or be sustainable maybe. But that's less a question of like what the humanities offers as opposed to or in relation to what the sciences offer, but more just a thinking about, well, what is the value of a university in the present moment, and what is the work that we do, who are we doing it for, what impact do we want it to have?
It's probably true that as a function of our training, sort of at least we in the humanities, we questions of values tend probably to be a little bit more central. I don't think it's actually entirely true that on the sciences side they're not that central. But that's the part that I think it's interesting to me, and it goes alongside with the publication of yours that you mentioned. Is that I've seen a sort of an attitude, a moral attitude on our campus, on our students, just to use that moral attitude as a way of not engaging or a way of completely disengaging. And I think that was the sad part of me. Again, the question was not even if the moral attitude was warranted or not. The question was we lost a certain openness to engage with one another. And it pained me because I felt like, no, that we can do way better than this alongside of all the other interventions. And at least that was the sort of attention that I wanted to sort of raise. And especially, I continue to be inspired. I attend sort of sciences talks a lot on our campus. And I see that actually there are really changes. It's not just about counting molecules anymore. It's the sort of the assumption that there is, the humanities have their own silos around values and scientists are in a different realm. I think it's really not actually what's going on our campus. But I think we can do better. I think that's my hope, yeah.
So why don't we take one more question, because I want to allow time for people to get more food before they come and take everything away. One more question? Okay. All the way in the back. He says, yeah.
Thank you very much. Although I had a question that, it was for all three, I guess the last portion made me want to ask something specifically about the virtues, of which, epistemological humility is one of them. And critical reasoning struck me interestingly to be there, and I was wondering if you could expand why. Because in this time and age in which unawareness of violence is perhaps something that we critique in other disciplines, of the violence, symbolic or otherwise, that can be inflicted from our work, it It seems to me that critical reasoning is not a virtue, but a very condition for knowledge, especially in places where violence is obliterated in the capacity for reasoning. And maybe not in the great United States, but, well, I would say so, but because in some places, I'm new to Oregon in my second year, and I find people in the grocery store with their dogs in a grocery cart where people put food, and that dog seems to have more human rights than a homeless person on the street. And there are many reasons for, to see why that is happening, why it has become a crisis of sorts. But my point is that the possibility for intelligence can be obliterated. And there is a right, I believe, perhaps problematically so, there should be a basic human right towards intellectual labor. And I was wondering about this virtue, because it's very cultural, or it has a cultural undertone. And I was wondering if you could expand on that, please.
Thanks. That's a great question. And it's one reason why I pose it as these are important to me, and I want to hear what's important to you, because I think that that is the way to talk about, the way possibly to avoid too much moral righteousness is to say, we're all fallible, and so let's have a conversation around these things. For me, even as I wrote it down, critical reasoning seemed to stick out as not aligning with the others, but I put it there purposefully because I think that we often think of critical reasoning as a toolkit of dispassionate, dispersonal objectivity, right? So I am going to take myself out of a cultural situatedness, in fact, and exercise critical reasoning. Whereas I would argue that virtues are cultural values, and critical reasoning thus is a cultural value. And it's important to recognize that there are cultural values that we are using in the academia, even when we're not naming them. And so this is what I was trying to do with this analogy to the seven liberal arts and the seven virtues from 1450, that we do have these fame-seeking, careerism, territoriality, the whole productivity that we're used to when we're putting in our tenure portfolios. We do have certain very culturally based values and virtues that are operating. We're just not naming them. And because we don't name them, we don't have an opportunity to have a conversation about them and an opportunity to suggest alternatives. And I would say that critical reasoning to many people might seem to be part of this package of I am apart from culture and I am apart from society. The main kind of defining feature of the history of science is that nothing right now, in its current form, is that there is no such thing as apart from society. There is no knowledge, there's no view from nowhere. So there is no condition of knowledge that is ever going to be from nowhere and not culturally situated and not historically situated. It is all going to be culturally and historically situated. To me, critical reasoning remains very culturally situated and extremely important because to me it is about democracy. And it is about how knowledge can be used as a way to question power rather than to be a tool to uphold power. This is what critical reasoning is. And so this is why I think critical reasoning is, in fact, a value that militates against some of the colonial values that I was laying out there.
Critical reasoning for me, I mean, one of the things that I'm sort of often reminded, and definitely I'm trying to sort of push in that classroom, is that more often than not, my perception is that I want to help our students to learn not how to share opinions, but to give reasons for their opinions. And that's really important for me. I think that that's the space of conversation is there, because there is a sense in which I'm not sort of fully engaging and or judging someone's opinion as much as I'm actually having a conversation about the reasons they are providing. So that's the one. So for me, the critical reason, it has reason in it, and it has the critical attitude, which I really think that one of the precious things about the critical attitude is the amount to which it comes with a skeptical attitude. the amount to really the sort of being able to call yourself into question, especially as you hold beliefs, and especially as you hold beliefs that are very close to your own personal identity. I think those are the hardest one to change. So that's at least why I would sort of still continue to cherish the critical reasoning part.
Would you join me in thanking